Deb bought her house in 1986 for $58,000. A modest three-bedroom on a quarter-acre, nothing special, in a town nobody was writing articles about. She put 10% down, took a rate that would make a modern buyer faint, and mostly forgot about the whole thing for the next 3 decades while she raised 2 kids and taught piano lessons out of the living room. She sold it 2 years ago for $410,000. Across the country, her nephew Ezra bought a house in 2021. Similar size, similar modest neighborhood, similar 10% down payment, similar starter home energy. He did everything right. Stable job, decent credit, a real estate agent who walked him through every step. He's owned it for 4 years now. His equity, after accounting for what he's actually paid down versus what he still owes, plus the closing costs he'll eat if he sells, roughly $31,000. Same family, same starter home strategy, same just get on the property ladder advice passed down at every Thanksgiving. One of them turned a house into a small fortune. The other is holding an asset that's barely outpaced what he would have made just leaving the down payment in a savings account. My name is Nick, and today we're figuring out why the exact same move, buy a modest house, hold it, let it appreciate, built one relative's retirement, and barely moved the needle for the other. And the reason isn't luck, and it isn't that Ezra did anything wrong. The math itself changed underneath both of them, and almost nobody explains how.
Let's start with a stat that sounds encouraging and is actually a bit of a magic trick. Homeowners in this country have a median net worth many times higher than renters. Some measures put it at more than 30 times higher. Say that out loud, and it sounds like the entire case for buying a house is closed. Buy a house, become rich, obviously. Except that that comparison is doing something sneaky. It's not really measuring what does a house do for your wealth. It's mostly measuring what kind of person tends to already have money by the time they're approved for a mortgage. Homeowners skew older, skew higher income, skew more likely to have had help with a down payment in the first place. Comparing homeowner net worth to renter net worth and concluding the house did this is a little like comparing the net worth of people who own sailboats to people who don't and concluding boats make you rich. The boat isn't nothing, but it's not doing what that headline number implies either. Here's the number that actually matters, and it's the one almost nobody puts in the headline. What a house purchased today is statistically likely to be worth relative to income compared to what it was decades ago. And this is where Deb and Ezra's story stops being about 2 individuals and starts being about 2 completely different housing markets wearing the same starter home costume. In the mid-1980s, when Deb bought her house, the typical home cost somewhere around 3 times the typical household's annual income. That ratio held, roughly, for decades. It's the ratio that made the whole buy a modest house, let it appreciate, retire comfortably plan mathematically reasonable for an entire generation. 3 times income is a stretch, but a survivable one for most dual-income households with a stable job. By the time Ezra bought his house, that ratio had drifted to somewhere well north of 5 times the typical household income in a lot of markets. In some of the most competitive metro areas, considerably higher than that. Same buy a starter home advice, completely different mathematical starting line. Deb's generation was buying at 3 times income and riding decades of appreciation on top of an already reasonable entry point. Ezra's generation is buying at 5+ times income, which means a much larger share of every dollar he puts toward the house is just buying access to shelter at all, not building the kind of surplus equity that compounds into a comfortable retirement. This is the actual gap, not effort, not financial literacy, not kids these days don't want to sacrifice. The starting ratio itself moved, and almost nobody adjusted the advice to match it.
Here's where it gets worse, and this is the part that rarely makes it into the just buy a house conversation. The cost of everything around the house moved too, and it moved faster than paychecks did. Property taxes, homeowners insurance, and maintenance costs have all climbed considerably faster than typical wage growth over the past 2 decades. Insurance, in particular, in a lot of regions, has jumped by double-digit percentages in recent years alone, driven by climate-related risk that simply didn't factor into Deb's 1986 policy the same way. Add in a mortgage rate environment where a buyer today is very plausibly financing at double or more what Deb originally locked in, and you get a scenario where 2 people can put down the identical percentage, buy an objectively similar house, and end up making wildly different monthly payments for wildly different amounts of actual house. Ezra isn't paying more because he chose a fancier house. He's paying more because the entire cost structure sitting on top of owning a house has quietly inflated faster than his paycheck has, in almost every direction at once. The purchase price, the insurance, the rate on the loan itself.
Let's go back to the lopsided comparison for a second, because it explains something crucial about how Deb's outcome happened almost automatically, in a way that isn't fully available to Ezra no matter what he does. When you buy at 3 times income, with a rate that leaves real room in the monthly budget, 2 things happen that compound on each other for 30 years. First, more of every payment goes toward the actual loan balance instead of interest, because the overall debt burden relative to income is lower to begin with. Second, decades of ordinary, unremarkable home price appreciation, nothing dramatic, just normal market drift, apply to an asset that was already purchased at a favorable ratio, which means the same percentage of appreciation translates into a much larger share of the original purchase price. Ezra is starting from a higher price relative to his income, a higher rate, and a shorter runway before the ratio-driven math either has to correct or the next generation faces an even steeper version of the same problem. He's not failing to replicate Deb's outcome. He's playing a version of the same game where several of the underlying rules quietly changed value before he sat down at the table.
I want to be direct about something, because it would be easy to end this video with, so save more, buy smarter, hustle harder, and call it a day. That would be comfortable. And it would also be dishonest. Ezra did the things Deb did: modest house, stable job, reasonable down payment, patient hold. The strategy that reliably built wealth for one generation is the same strategy that, for a meaningful share of the next generation, mostly builds a place to live and a fairly thin sliver of equity on top of it. Not because the strategy is wrong, but because the ratio it depends on has moved further out of reach in a lot of places. At the same time, other costs layered on top of it moved in the wrong direction too. That doesn't mean buying a house is pointless. Owning tends to build more long-run wealth than renting for people who can genuinely afford the full, honest cost of it, not just the mortgage, but the insurance, the maintenance, the opportunity cost of the down payment.
but the specific version of the story where a modest starter home quietly becomes a comfortable retirement almost by accident, the way it did for Deb, that version depended on a set of ratios that existed for a specific stretch of decades, and a lot of people are now being handed the same advice without being told the ratios underneath it have shifted. If you're looking at a purchase today, the number worth calculating, honestly, isn't can I afford the monthly payment? It's the full ratio. Total price relative to your actual income, plus a realistic estimate of insurance and maintenance in your specific area, run against how long you genuinely intend to stay. The house that quietly builds wealth today is less often any modest starter home held long enough, and more often the specific house where the full math, not just the mortgage payment, actually pencils out relative to what you make. That's a less comforting, more complicated piece of advice than what Deb's generation got to operate on. But it's the honest one, and pretending the ratio never moved just sets the next Ezra up to wonder what he did wrong when the answer was never really about him. I'm not a financial advisor, and this isn't financial advice, just a pattern worth understanding before you sign anything. If this changed how you're thinking about a purchase, or if you've lived some version of the Deb and Ezra gap in your own family, tell me about it in the comments. I actually read them.